An American military unit is stationed at a checkpoint during the Iraq War as the film opens on a ticket. Suddenly, a speeding automobile comes from a distance with its occupants shooting rounds. Pictures. It is discovered that the assailants are a gang of insurgents from Iraq who breach the checkpoint and start firing. Aiming. Sergeant Brandon, the mastermind of the ambush, gives the order for his men to pursue the assailants. Anne. The troops then open fire on the rebels throughout the town's streets, setting up a furious pursuit. They ultimately get to an alley without realizing there could be danger there. Go ahead. The squad gets out of the car and approaches the alley with caution. Alley. A fierce battle breaks out between the two groups as the rebels soon make an assault from the rooftops. While two troops are sadly killed when a rocket-propelled grenade hits one of their jeeps at this time. Subsequently, the rebels launch an additional grenade from the rooftops, causing it to explode on a civilian car. Tommy, one of the troops, just so happens to be next to the car when the explosion occurs. In a show of valor, Rico, a different soldier, bravely falls over Tommy to protect him. However, Tommy suffers terrible injuries from burns all over his body. Brandon quickly runs to see how Rico is doing as the other members of the team cover fire. In order to protect the wounded soldier from further assaults, he swiftly maneuvers him into a neighboring alley. Shortly after, hostile gunfire strikes another soldier, Preacher, injuring his neck and jaw severely. Tommy, his closest buddy, runs to him, but the pastor dies in his arms. Sergeant Steve pursues one of the rebels into a home as the others keep firing shots. When Brandon rushes into the home to assist his longtime buddy Steve after learning that he has been injured, he discovers several dead women and children with their blood all over the place. Before things become worse, he assists Steve, who is hurt, in leaving the home. 3 U.S. Army troops are killed in the ambush, and one is badly wounded as a consequence of this terrifying encounter. Brandon heads back to his little Texas town with his buddy soldier. The town extends them a hearty welcome, and then there's a parade. But their survival is the only thing that really merits celebration. The troops are joined by family and friends at a modest welcome party at a local bar in the next scene, where they are inebriatedly reminiscing about the horrific warfare they endured throughout the war. Others are obviously uncomfortable because of this, but he doesn't realize it. He then says he wants to be a part of the sniper squad so they may use it to take out the Iraqi insurgents that evening in order to exact revenge for their lost friends. Upon receiving a call from Michelle, his childhood friend, Steve's fiancée rushes to their home, perceiving that she is upset, and discovers Steve excavating a hole in the front yard. When Brandon attempts to reach him, he is unable to do so. Steve keeps digging as if they're on a mission in a conflict zone, lost in contemplation. It becomes evident that he is experiencing a mental collapse, most likely as a result of wartime PTSD. Surprisingly, Brandon finds the home in disarray shortly after entering it to speak with Michelle. Michelle goes on to say that when Steve was intoxicated, he began to think that people were trying to harm him. Then he began digging a hole outside and plundered the whole home. Brandon suddenly discovers Michelle's cheek has a bruise. She sobs as she admits that during his inebriated tantrum, Steve unintentionally hit her. While they converse, they see Steve, still clutching a rifle, nodding off in the outside hole. Tommy hits a tree with his vehicle when he gets to their home a few moments later. Tommy, who is obviously drunk, tells Brandon that his wife Jai forced him out due to his drinking issues. Then he tells Brandon that he is going to spend a few days in their cabin out of town. Brandon expresses empathy for him as well and recommends that the team members join him at the cabin so they can unwind and take a break. The troops drank in the cabin till the next morning. While his pal Shorty reads the gift cards aloud, Tommy entertains himself by firing down his wedding presents. The sound of gunfire abruptly wakes Steve. He gets dressed quickly and staggers out of the vehicle trunk, much to the amusement of the other members of the squad. Subsequently, they observe silently as Steve aims and destroys his and Michelle's present. Later on in the evening, Brandon questions Steve about a bruise on his face when he takes him away for a private talk. At first, Steve dismisses it, saying he just walked into a door. But Brandon, caught off guard, sees through his deception and confronts him straight about striking Michelle. Steve acknowledges that he doesn't recall the violent encounter and that he may have blacked out and woken up after their bar party. Tommy is abruptly informed by Brandon in the trunk of his vehicle that day that such attitude is not acceptable and that the squad redeployment is returning to their military SSEs. Tommy is advised by Brandon to lead the recruits as he prepares to be released from service. Nevertheless, to his dismay, he gets orders to return to combat in Iraq. Because he's still getting over the recent death of his allies, Brandon finds it hard to accept his destiny. Furious, Brandon approaches Lieutenant Colonel Boot, his superior officer, to discuss the directive. Boot clarifies that the military's stop-loss policy serves as the foundation for the instruction. Brandon is reminded by Angry Boot of his squad leader responsibilities and the value of obeying commands. Boot accuses him of defying a clear directive from his superiors when he doesn't comply. Expanding progressively, Brandon is reminded by Angry Boot of his squad leader responsibilities and the value of obeying commands. Boot accuses him of defying a clear directive from his superiors when he doesn't comply. Brandon is to be held in a military jail by his soldiers until he is redeployed, per Ben's instructions. Soon after, two soldiers drag Brandon towards the jail, but he fights back and stops them. Steve warns Brandon not to take this chance and advises him to contact Boot for assistance while he's on the way. He tells the story of the whole thing and explains why he decided to go AWOL when he found out he was being redeployed to Iraq. Steve advises Brandon not to take this chance and to ask Boot for assistance. But Brandon confesses that Boot wants to punish him, and he is certain about his escape strategy. Steve comforts Brandon and says he'll assist him in solving the problem. Brandon finds the Searchtown sheriff waiting when he gets home. Brandon's parents are informed by the sheriff of his AWOL status and that Boot has personally ordered a statewide hunt for him. Brandon's parents are urged to advise him to give up and accept responsibility for his conduct by the sheriff. The sheriff departs, and Brandon sits down with Michelle, his parents, and goes over everything. He then suggests bringing the issue before a senator, but his father forewarns him of the repercussions of going against the established order. Because their family is being watched by the military, Brandon makes the decision to go to Washington, D.C. to handle the situation himself. Instead, Michelle offers to go for a drive with him. Along the way, they pause to make a reservation. The next morning, Tommy begs Boot for another chance and vows to become a better soldier as Brandon and Michelle hide from the police officers who have come seeking for them. Their predicament's tension is the cause of this. The next morning, Tommy begs Boot for another chance and vows to become a better soldier as Brandon and Michelle hide from the police officers who have come seeking for them. Subsequently, Steve contacts Brandon to let him know that he was in the prison all night attempting to free Tommy on a DUI charge. He continues by lamenting the fact that Brandon, who leads their team, isn't there to deal with these kinds of situations. Brandon just informed me that he was going to meet with the senator in Washington, D.C. Steve is further angrier as he worries about Michelle's safety as well as his own. Then, Brandon tells him that he will make a swift return later that evening and makes a commitment to drop her off before reaching the state border. Michelle and Brandon pay a visit. One of the men under Brandon's leadership slain in the alley ambush was the preacher's family member who was involved in the aftermath. Even though the preacher's parents are involved, Brandon describes the terrifying specifics of the ambush. When Brandon and Michelle go back to their vehicle and see that the window has been shattered, they tell them how much they appreciate that Brandon took the time to stop by and check in. Michelle is told to wait for Brandon while he goes to an alley to find the guilty parties. The guys assault Brandon when he approaches them, and in spite of the circumstances, one of them pulls a revolver. Just before Brandon is about to fire, Brandon disarms the assault and makes them all kneel as if ready to execute them. Reluctantly, Brandon accepts when Michelle steps in to stop and convinces him to go with her. They then check into a motel room close by, where Brandon encounters yet another wall. The soldier continues to describe the hardships after disclosing that the senator would not be able to assist. Steve pays them a visit at the hotel in the morning, can assist him with organizing the forge release paperwork. Also, he clarifies that Brendan would be able to create a new identity in Canada, which would greatly simplify his life as a runaway. Steve pays them a visit at the hotel in the morning. After learning about their whereabouts from Michelle, he shows up in uniform to get Brandon. Then he tells him that he and Boot have made an agreement wherein all accusations against Brandon would be dropped, provided that he gets back to the base in 14 hours. Furious, Brandon accuses Steve of making choices behind his back. Then it is discovered that Steve has re-enlisted and offered to go back to Iraq. Michelle is enraged and doubts Steve's dedication to their union and their intended marriage. He reassures her that once he returns from his duty, they will still tie the knot. She doesn't say anything, however, since she thinks Steve made a bad choice. Finally, unable to bear his deception and lack of communication, she makes the decision to call it quits on their relationship. Not long after the two men walk outdoors, Tommy's continuous battle with drinking is disclosed by Steve. He argues that the squad only respects Brandon as their commander in an attempt to get Brandon to rejoin him. But Brandon is determined about his choice and highlights the flaws in the war. Steve tells him straight out that the senator will not assist him since he is a wall. Later, when Brandon phones the office of the Aftermath senator, he finds out that the senator is not available to meet with him since he is on the run. Meanwhile, Tommy is caught up by Steve, who is now dangerously inebriated once again. Steve attempts to talk him out of seeing his wife, Jai, despite his insistence. Tommy responds sharply, saying he has no business giving relationship counsel. Steve then turns to leave in a hurry. Rico, a soldier who valiantly saved Tommy during the attack in Iraq, is visited by Brandon and Michelle. Rico describes the terrible severity of his wounds. The explosion during their chat has left him with serious face burns, lost his vision, and severed his right arm and leg. Rico describes the horrifying circumstances at the hospital, along with the sounds of war veterans' cries and dreams. Rico is nonetheless grateful that he is no longer in a combat zone and that he survived. Later, Brandon shares with Michelle the confusion and turmoil on the battlefield. He continues by talking about his anguish and grief over his fellow soldiers' deaths. He also discusses his regret for unintentionally killing several innocent Iraqi citizens. Brandon gets in touch with the attorney suggested by the other wall shortly after. Soldier, the lawyer tells him to meet in a restaurant with $11,000. In order to get the necessary funds at the diner, Brandon and Michelle sell their vehicle and trade it in for a bike. There's no going back, the attorney tells them. He then provides Brandon a new set of identity papers and a phone number to contact after this. The attorney clarifies that when he contacts the number, a plan will be made for him to be picked up at his new location. Thereafter, when Tommy takes his own life in the woodland cabin during the burial ceremony, Brandon phones his mother and finds out the heartbreaking news. When everyone has departed, Brandon pays his respects at Tommy's grave. Steve shows up shortly after and confronts Brandon, accusing him of abandoning Tommy and abandoning himself. As they each battle their sadness and rage, they end up fighting physically. When the fight finally ends, Saideve breaks down in tears as Brandon leaves the scene. Brandon struggles with the understanding that abandoning all he knows won't let his inner conflict go away. He chooses not to enter Mexico because he thinks that fleeing the battle now won't allow him to fully put it behind. The boundary. Brandon finds it difficult to accept that leaving behind all he knows won't make his inner agony go away. He makes the decision not to enter Mexico because he thinks that fleeing the conflict now won't allow him to really put it behind. When Brandon's parents show there to say farewell, Michelle greets them. As Brandon, Steve, and the other troops are ready to move to another combat zone, the film comes to a conclusion.